Now I'd like to introduce somebody who is a surprise speaker today. Some of you will recognize immediately his name, having seen Gaslands. All of you will recognize the message that he brings to us. And to kick it all off, we welcome Weston Wilson.
Thank you. I must say, as a civil servant, applause before I speak is unheard of. How many have seen the movie Gasland? How many? Right, let's switch it. How many have not? Oh, there's 3 people. In the movie, pivotal national movie, Gasland by Josh Fox, I'm the whistleblower. Because I'm the whistleblower, in fact. I'll get a little closer. Can you hear me now? Because I'm the whistleblower, in fact, and I'm going to give a little presentation I gave just last month at Snowbird, Utah, to the National River Rally. The focus will be here on the history of the exemption of this practice of hydraulic fracking. Starting actually in the year 2000, the slide says 2004 when the study was completed, but starting in the year 2000, EPA was ordered by the 11th Circuit Court in Florida to do an analysis of hydraulic fracking with respect to how the injection of these fluids would comply with the Safe Drinking Water Act. Well, unbeknownst to me and the nation, Dick Cheney influenced that study. And Dick Cheney, at first, I understand, tried to order the administrator of EPA, Christy Todd Whitman, not to do any study. If you want to see a pivotal document on this, look at Tom Hamburger's Los Angeles Times October '04 study, or his article, out of the Los Angeles Times. So when I pick it up is when EPA is finishing this study. So it completes a final study in June of '04, focused on the use of these hydraulic fracking fluids in coal bed. The reasoning of the agency was, on that point, was solid. Coal is used in the West as a source of drinking water and also a source of gas. So they looked at this specific practice with respect to fracking coal for methane. But the study was fraudulent. The study was difficult to unravel why it was so bizarre, because it had reasonable conclusions that the injection of these fracking fluids was toxic, that not all the material returned, and then it concluded that it caused no risk, and there was no further need for study. So EPA approved there was benzene and other toxics in the groundwater as a result of fracking. It had a panel of its own peer-reviewed panel did not comply with the agency's limitations on financial conflicts of interest or appearance of financial conflict, because 5 of the 7 members of the panel had ties to the oil and gas industry. So this is what I'm saying. EPA concludes fracking is safe then, and does not pose a risk. That was a pivotal study for Congress. You recall in Bush's second term, right when he was doing right after the inaugural speech in January '05, that the then President Bush said, "I'm going to spend my political capital." This is one of his spendings. So that summer, Congress passed, and I must say, relatively bipartisan way. For instance, then Senator Salazar, now the Secretary of Interior, voted for this act, called the Energy Policy Act. So EPA's finding that the injection of toxic materials did not cause a risk and did not require a further study was pivotal in giving cover, sort of, to those who would vote for this exemption. I must say quickly here, the industry is going to come back and say there never was an obligation under the Safe Drinking Water Act to include fracking. That's just dealing with semantics. They need to understand, you all need to understand, the direction of the United States District Court out of the 11th Circuit ordering EPA to regulate fracking. What I did, how many of you might be familiar with my October report to Congress? It's readily available on the web, and I have a copy here, but check it out for your historic records. It is narrow and flawed at this point based on what we know today, but it still was an important document. And it said, I said, working with staff at EPA in Denver, that for these various reasons, the Inspector General of EPA should investigate EPA for fraud, and that Congress ought to consider this with respect to what it's acting on, how it acts on the Act. At the time, Henry Waxman, how many of you know of Congressman Henry Waxman out of Sacramento District, an important player? So I met with Henry Waxman, and subsequently, Mr. Waxman wrote to the Inspector General of EPA. And one of his statements was just the obvious. The allegations that I made were proven in EPA's report. It's odd, isn't it? I was making an allegation that EPA had proven. Things have changed. In the movie, I mentioned that the Obama administration and Administrator Jackson have not yet ordered the EPA to begin work on this problem. Things have changed. As a result of a congressional committee recommendation to EPA, EPA announced in March that it would begin a national study on hydraulic fracking and its risks. It's kind of underfunded. This probably would be a $40 or $50 million demand here. And it is trying to deal with this problem of transparency and have adequate peer review, not with conflict. It's led by Dr. Richard Pools, the senior hydrologist out of our Office of Research and Development in Ada, Oklahoma, and a team of scientists that I have great confidence in. It's supposedly in their scoping, which was available for public review. How many might have seen that? Oh, that's good. Stay on top of this. On every point that the Science Advisory Board of EPA allows public opportunity. But they had an opportunity in, I guess April, to look at this, at the scope of the study. And that's where we learned that it was based on life cycle impacts. And certainly not limited to coal bed methane. What it doesn't say is important, though. It doesn't say they're going to study Dimmick or Hickory or Pavilion, Wyoming or Garfield County. In fact, the regional administrator of EPA made a special point to the scientists that Pavilion, Wyoming work would not be part of this study. I cannot explain that exactly. But in part, it deals with the issue that Barbara Arundel and I were so aggressively discussing on the way up here. It deals with this, a problem that scientists have. I would say it's a problem, but it's rather essential that you have baseline information preceding your investigation in order to understand the trend, particularly in the case of hydraulic fracking with respect to other sources of the contaminants, either natural sources as in methane or other products widely used for other purposes that might appear in the groundwater. So scientists are intrigued by going to a clean place and looking where it might change, rather than going to a dirty place and trying to figure out what changed. This is an industry that doesn't need to comply with the law because our elected officials have allowed that. Now, let me say at the outset, what I'm talking here about these exemptions only applies to oil and gas drilling. In the law, it's known as oil and gas exploration and production. The industry will come back and just try to confuse the public and say, we are subject to these laws. But they're subject when they transport and refine. So these exemptions apply to oil and gas exploration and production, drilling. They're exempt from the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. That's the nation's Hazardous Waste Act. It's called the Bevel Amendment for Senator Bevel, who provided that. So oil and gas exploration that produces toxic waste does not have to comply with the stringent provisions of the Hazardous Waste Protection Act, known as the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. It's exempt from the Clean Air Act. You know, that's a little bit of misstatement on mine. It's actually exempt from the Clean Air Act regulations by virtue of the agency's EPA is not able to aggregate the sources. So what EPA naturally, when it sets a rule, says we're not going to catch the little guy. We're going to catch the big guy on the Clean Air Act. So they have these triggering standards, roughly 150 tons of particulates, 10 tons of volatile organic. If you have one source that is over that, you're regulated. If you have multiple sources, even though they might be linked in the oil field, you're not regulated. And as we talked about, they're exempt from the Safe Drinking Water Act, made explicit in Section 238 of the Energy Policy Act, the act that was passed in August 2005. And then that might be commonly known in the press as the Halliburton loophole. You know, that's kind of a pejorative term that activists have given correctly because it applies to the largest, three largest companies. Actually, there's just 3 companies that do 90% of this. JB Services, Schlumberger, and Halliburton. Now, you probably are familiar with the split estate type of a problem where the surface owner doesn't own the subsurface minerals, and that plus just broadly corporate rights under these federal and state preference rights makes leasing guarantees that the industry rules, is what I say. You know, after you lease, the horse is out of the barn. After a lease is a preference right, it's a contract. It's irrevocable by one party.